"Get your hands off the cooling ports, they're surging," barked Rourke Miles, already pushing past two startled technicians as the readout on the terraforming relay began to distort into flickering green arcs. The alarms had triggered late, maybe by seconds, but in orbital strike conditions seconds were fatal. The ground beneath the control station jolted like something had wrenched the crust itself. One of the overhead beams shuddered, and glass panels from the upper observation rig collapsed in jagged sheets. He ducked low, shielding his head with one arm while dragging a systems analyst down with the other. Above them, the cloud layers, which had been manipulated for moisture regulation just hours earlier, cracked open with an unnatural glow. Not lightning, but refracted atmospheric combustion. Someone screamed behind the console banks, not out of fear but confusion, the kind of sound made when reality no longer aligned with protocol. The station had reinforced substructure. It was not designed to withstand orbital bombardment, and yet something was hammering down in rhythmic succession. Each hit not directly overhead, but close enough to cause cascading failures in their climate control grids. Data feeds jittered, scrambled, then blacked out entirely. "Check for off-site links," Rourke shouted, reaching for the manual bypass on the command node, his fingertips slipping on a growing streak of what he realized, too late, was blood. Not his. He turned. Where Lyra had been seconds ago, there was only the shattered support girder, bent inward from above, embedded in the ground like a blade from the sky. Her hand, still visible beneath the wreckage, twitched once. Then nothing. The technician he had saved was speaking, maybe even sobbing, but Rourke heard none of it. The impact wave had ruptured his left eardrum. What he did register was the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure outside the walls, oxygen levels fluctuating unnaturally. They hadn't just targeted the living sectors, the bastards were hitting the life support zones. That meant intent. That meant annihilation by design. The emergency shutters snapped downward, blocking what remained of the outside view. Dust and coolant hissed from ruptured ducts, mixing with the overcharged capacitor heat to form an invisible fog that left a metallic taste on the tongue and burned the throat with every breath. No order had come, no announcement, no transmission, just the assault. It wasn't war, it was a purge. He stumbled toward the lower lift corridor, now half collapsed, and forced the access panel open with a boot heel crack. With auxiliary power surging unpredictably, the cabin lights flickered erratically, never staying steady long enough to orient properly. He grabbed the emergency rope rail, lashed it to the floor rung, and descended one level at a time. When he reached the ground corridor, if it could still be called that, sections of the tunnel had caved inward from above. Rebar hung in loops, twisted like vines. Sparks from damaged electrical lines danced across pooled water from ruptured cooling units. Each step felt heavier, not just from exertion or injury, but from the realization settling deeper into his bones. This wasn't a mistake. This was a demonstration. As he passed a broken wall panel displaying a looping heads-up alert, static stained but unmistakable, he recognized the colony's primary orbital shield icon blinking red. Shield breach, full collapse. No defense platforms had engaged. No interceptors had scrambled. Whatever struck them bypassed or shut down the entire early warning net before the first impact. That required insider calibration. Someone knew the defense cadence intimately. His leg buckled as he turned toward the biodome access hall, the prosthetic knee joint jamming from a direct hit to the lower casing. He collapsed against the wall. Pain wasn't the worst part. Pain was familiar. It was the silence, the kind that followed mass displacement, the kind that came only when everything else had already been lost. Crawling across the entry stair to the comms suite, he reached the operator station. Everything above was cored out. The dome had been breached and ejected into vacuum. What remained was a skeleton frame and a scatter of blackened soil, once fertile and living, now crusted with flakes of fused silica. Greenhouse monitors blinked in slow succession, unable to understand that the dome was already gone. He activated a hardline transmitter, if only to try to bounce a signal off the old relay tower. No connection, not even background radiation. The upper atmosphere had been ionized. probably intentionally. That meant they didn't just want to destroy Vulna Primus. They wanted to erase it. Across the hall, 2 survivors emerged from the corridor's edge, one dragging a collapsed mining crewman, the other carrying a med pack on his back. Their faces were covered in grime, dried blood streaked across their sleeves. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They simply paused as Rourke looked up, nodded once, then turned their focus back to triage. His fingers tightened on the control panel's edge. Lyra had worked this post before their reassignment to agricultural maintenance. She'd used the auxiliary transmit board to send terrain updates. Now, it lay fractured, one corner burned through, the other still blinking with a frozen message half-typed, confirming, "New soil layer full integrity will update next cycle." There would be no next cycle. He heard movement again. More survivors, maybe 6 in total, gathering in the lower structure. Someone was tearing through an emergency ration box. Another was stitching up a wound with a trembling hand. There was no command structure left, no officers. But then someone asked, quietly, without looking up, "What do we do now?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't fearful. It was mechanical. Spoken not to a superior, but to the only person still moving with direction. Rourke rose, his prosthetic leg locked back into place with a sharp metallic click. He scanned what remained of the hall, the smoke-filtered ceiling, the ragged survivors, the cracked soil panel beside the last line his wife had ever typed. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, it was slow, not loud, not commanding, just steady. "We document, then we plan." No one cheered. No one nodded. But no one questioned it either. The next hour passed with makeshift triage, signal logging, and body cataloging. They found 77 survivors in total, scattered throughout the lowest tunnels. It wasn't a rescue. It was containment. Above them, Vulna Primus no longer functioned as a colony. It had become evidence. Rourke sat alone that night by the ruined outer dome, helmet set beside him, air thick with engine oil from a failing drone that kept trying to restart its ruined sensor array. He stared at the cracked visor still in his hand, the one Lyra had left behind after their last maintenance rotation. The blood smear across it had dried black. He didn't weep. He didn't pray. He wrote. 4 pages. A systems log disguised as an after-action report, coded through biosignal notations, and time-stamped with the second, even Zero's destruction, had become inevitable. The report was already in his hand when the shuttle touched down. No fanfare, no salutes. The docking platform at Earth's orbital command ring was almost deserted, save for 2 intake officers and a cargo loader that never stopped humming under its own maintenance cycle. Rourke disembarked in silence, one foot clicking hard against the platform as the magnetic lock in his prosthetic adjusted to planetary gravity. In his right hand, the thin polymer file pulsed with heat, not from emotion, but from embedded thermal shielding that had protected its core while he'd ridden on a scavenged evac carrier that bypassed all formal lanes. He wasn't cleared. No one had approved this trip, but no one had stopped him either. Not yet. The corridor leading into the Earth Security Council's holding chambers smelled of oxidized copper and recycled moisture, hallmarks of an old infrastructure still pretending to be new. Everything looked polished until you touched it. A security node blinked amber as he approached. No credentials, no access. "I'm not here for entry, just attention," he told the sensor, sliding the file into the data gate and initiating an unclassified transfer burst. He watched the alert run up the wall feed. He knew someone would be watching. Not everyone in the building had buried their spine. The door unlocked 3 minutes later. Inside, a handful of loosely connected officials sat around the outer ring of the executive floor, arguing over the phrasing of a statement no one would read. The room was designed to project stability. Staggered ceiling lights, transparent panel walls overlooking cloud-managed forests, and a silence that felt curated. But the council members themselves were scattered and uneven, their voices layered with quiet panic disguised as restraint. so we'll refer to them as unidentified orbital aggressors until satellite archives give confirmation. We can't start naming species unless we're prepared to defend. Eddie were identified, the Salk heart signatures verified, we have the impact telemetry, we have footage from 6 locations. We also have 2 neighboring powers watching our response time. Which is why we don't escalate without protocol. That was when Rourke stepped into view, carrying nothing but the report and the look of a man already done with excuses. "Gentlemen," he began, without waiting to be acknowledged, "you've had over a week to do more than, quote, regulations. What you haven't done is act." Half of them looked up. One, a gray-suited diplomat whose badge showed the Terran envoy to Kepler Reach, opened his mouth. Rourke set the file down before he could speak. "This is Theta 9. I authored it. I lived through Vulna. My recommendations are not theoretical." The room fell quiet, as if someone had just activated a noise suppression field. Though none had. The envoy broke first. "You're not on roster, Mr. Commander," Rourke corrected, not with pride, but with legal clarity. "Rourke Miles, retired, reinstated under Executive Code 4.2 during emergency protocol." A second figure stood, a younger official, in naval black, clearly uncomfortable but more engaged than the rest. Emergency protocol wasn't activated. Rourke's reply was slow, dry. "It should have been." The older diplomat stepped forward, tapping the file's seal. "You expect us to greenlight an independent counteroffensive based on black ops theories and tactical sabotage algorithms? This isn't doctrine. It's destabilization, wrapped in vendetta." "Vendetta implies personal bias," Rourke replied. "This is systemic survival." Another counselor, one of the few military officers in attendance, thumbed through the first page. His eyes didn't widen. They narrowed. This targets their hive infrastructure. These aren't fleet strikes. This is psychological warfare, embedded viral architecture, misinformation seeding. "Yes," Rourke said. "That's the point. Their strength is order. Disrupt the pattern, and the architecture collapses. Like removing critical lines from a circuit." "You're talking about genocide," someone murmured. "No," Rourke corrected, stepping forward and placing both hands on the edge of the table. "They initiated species erasure protocols. What I'm proposing is a calibrated dismantling of their logistical continuity. I'm not targeting civilians, I'm targeting command reflex." The silence that followed wasn't out of awe. It was tension stretched between 3 positions: fear, ethics, and self-preservation. The room dimmed briefly as the storm shutters responded to a solar flare report. The flickering lights made the table feel like it had just lost power, and for a moment, everyone sat still. Unwilling to speak in the half-dark, Rourke leaned over the table and tapped the corner of the file. "You won't find anything in there that contradicts our accords. Every tactic is based on existing network vulnerabilities the Salkari themselves exposed. What you will find are the metrics I built from the orbital burn layers at Vulna. You'll see the paths of descent, the yield ratios, the frequency of impact. It wasn't conquest, it was elimination." The younger officer, Captain Halwyn based on his shoulder tag, spoke quietly. "Even if you're right, this would need off-book approval. It wouldn't pass standard command routes. I didn't come for approval. I came for silence." "You don't have to endorse it. You just have to not obstruct it." Murmurs passed, not consensus, just friction. And then, a hand reached out. The military counselor who had read most of Theta 9 closed the file and pushed it toward the central intake port. "Leave it. If we touch it officially, it's an act of war, but if someone else acts..." He let the sentence hang. Rourke understood. As he turned to leave, the older diplomat called after him. "And if this fails? What if your operation makes things worse?" Rourke stopped at the door, not looking back. "Then they'll escalate. And so will we. But unlike them, we don't mistake silence for surrender." He left the chamber before the shutters fully reopened. Outside, a Loa Catmo shuttle stood waiting. Not government issue, no identifying markings. One of the side compartments bore the freshly installed compartment for encrypted field logistics. Inside it was a pack containing old credentials, cold implants, and an unmarked rifle case that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. He boarded without hesitation. The file was still uploading on an internal secure loop, copied 3 times, one for records, one for the operation team, and one final fragment sent to a deep relay node orbiting an uninhabited moon off Vega Station. By the time Earth's Security Council finished debating phrasing, Theta 9 was already in motion, and Scorchwing was already being assembled. The vessel that carried Rourke miles away from Earth had no name, only a registration code flagged as decommissioned 3 years prior. It didn't follow standard transit lanes, nor did it transmit beacon signals. It skimmed the edge of Sol's outer patrol radius, then jumped through a short-cycle skip point near the abandoned Kravik mining belt, a maneuver few pilots attempted twice, given its gravitic turbulence and the risk of frying onboard comms. Rourke never flinched. He wasn't flying it. He was reviewing dossiers. Each profile had already passed triple-screen clearance. Off-the-books operatives, unlisted affiliations, no family ties, and no traceable digital presence for the last 10 years. The backgrounds varied. Some were former infiltration analysts, others field engineers with access to cognitive interference systems. None had served in standard fleet combat. That was deliberate. The ship docked at Station Varnix 4, a former solar research array turned ghost platform after the orbital decay warnings proved too costly to address. It hovered now on solar thrusters alone, powered just enough to keep gravity and filtration online. That made it perfect. Inside, the lights stayed dim even at full burn. Walls were stripped of insignia. Former station names had been carved out with plasma scrapes, leaving only blank panels. Every corridor was functional and bare. No markers, no comfort. That, too, was by design. When Rourke stepped into the core assembly hall, 20 men were already waiting. Another 20 would arrive over the next 3 hours. They didn't speak. Not yet. Each stood in formation, not because they'd been ordered to, but because there was no other option that felt appropriate. A tall, wiry man stepped forward and handed Rourke a datapad. 40, as requested, all with internalized neural pattern buffers, no live implants beyond read-only response filters, nothing traceable. Rourke nodded once. Designation. Operative tags only, no names, call signs cleared by rotation. He glanced over the list. Call signs like Hatch, Drell, Iron, Bishop. No cod names that hinted at roles or tactics. No hierarchy implied. Gear status. Standardized suits, mag seal, AVA capable, atmospheric cycling, no insignia. Neural spike interfaces are hardwired into the wrist panels. Tactical overlays only sync to the user. We stripped all voice AI from the HUDs to prevent adaptive recognition. What about ethics lockdowns? Rourke asked. The man hesitated. We didn't install any. The room quieted further when the display screens lowered. There was no anthem, no mission briefing montage, just a single line blinking across the bottom of the screen. Table Zeta, vectors established, permission offline. Rourke stepped forward. The room wasn't large. It was meant for astrophysics lectures once. Now it smelled faintly of soldered wiring and reconditioned oxygen. He looked over them, men with blank patches on their arms, eyes that didn't scan the room but rather cataloged it in parts. Each one had read the same proposal. Each one had agreed, without condition. I'm not going to ask you why you came, Rourke began. We passed that point a week ago. Someone adjusted their stance. Another clenched a gloved fist. Not anger, tension being processed mechanically. You're here because protocol failed. Our colonies burned because someone decided logic mattered more than life. You're here because you know that response must now come from those who weren't trained to wait for approval. The man in the third row raised a hand. Sir, clarification, what constitutes an acceptable boundary of operation? You'll know when you reach it. And if we pass it? Rourke's reply was simple. Then we escalate. He didn't need to inspire them. He needed them calibrated. They moved next to the simulation bay. It wasn't a training ground, no weapons drills, no mock engagements. It was a systems environment, loaded with reconstructed Salkari bionetwork schematics, logic path models, and hive infrastructure approximations. Every operative was assigned a neural spike. Once connected, they had full memory bleed of the Salkari environmental behavior loops, predictive modeling, failure cascades, and adaptive misdirection patterns. "You're not here to fight ships," Rourke said. "You're here to break a system. And systems don't scream when they die. They collapse, silently." One of the older men, call sign Thorn, stepped back after an hour in simulation and sat down hard on the floor plating. "They don't operate on emotion," he said quietly. "Their logic trees are recursive. You bend one node and it just branches another way." "Correct," Rourke said. "So you don't bend it. You fake a collapse from within. Feed it triggers it already understands and let it dismantle itself trying to compensate." It was the same principle as introducing faulty code into a closed feedback loop. The Salkari structure depended on predictability. They didn't guard against false signals because they didn't believe in them. Another operative, Vance, quiet and clean-cut, asked a different question. "What happens after? Once it works?" "Then we vanish," Rourke replied. "No medals, no history." The room accepted that without resistance. He watched them in small clusters that evening. They didn't bond in traditional ways. No handshakes, no shared stories. But they began forming patterns, standing at the same intervals, reviewing simulations in mirrored orders, even syncing meal cycles without speaking. It was cohesion born from purpose, not personality. Rourke sat at a stripped console and watched the feeds. Every action taken on Varnex 4 was logged manually and stored on analog drives. Nothing transmitted, no cloud, no backups. Scorchwing wasn't just a team. It was an erasure protocol wearing human skin. When the final operative arrived, call sign Karen, formerly listed as MAI from a Mars sabotage program, Rourke held his gaze a little longer. There were no questions, just a silent acknowledgement. You were dead to the world already. Now you're just functional. Later that night, they held the only ceremonial moment of the operation. Not a speech, not a chant, just a silent oath. Each man pressed his right hand to the flat plate above the decommissioned reactor core. The pulse sensors read biosigns, logged the imprint, then powered down. No record, just the press of flesh to cold alloy. Rourke remained the last in the room. The first transmission was whispered into a Salkari relay tower they'd never physically touched. That was the brilliance of it. There was no launch signature, no heat trace, no human presence in the system. Just a looping signal encoded to mimic a Salkari distress cadence. Not the human distress tone, not the universal distress frequency. Their pattern. It came from what appeared to be a drifting shuttle near the border of the Lakari trade lanes, transmitting one message, over. Hive memory breach. Lokari junction collapsed. Vital line compromised. Awaiting purification. There was no context, no coordinates. Just that. The kind of message that didn't belong to any known Salkari fleet but sounded just close enough to trigger a reflexive sweep. Rourke watched it bounce across 6 nodes before the Salkari command net swallowed it for analysis. That was how it began. They called the operation Phantom Echo. At first, there was no direct sign of success, no retaliation, no signal back, nothing to intercept or record. But 2 days later, one of the Salkari convoy fleets never arrived at its expected terminal in the Kalthus sector. 5 destroyers, 3 bulk freighters. Gone. There were no debris fields, no distress signals, nothing. They didn't need to confirm it. The fact that the Salkari had dispatched another recon unit along the same path was evidence enough. Scorchwing hadn't destroyed anything physically. They'd sent a signal, a ghost frequency, and watched the enemy trip over their own response. Back aboard Station Varnex 4, the data room went quiet. It wasn't awe, it was adjustment. They had confirmed that the Salkari's decision-making lattice responded to threat cues without verifying origin. That was the crack they needed. Rourke moved to the second phase. He nodded to Thorne, who accessed the compiled biosignal package designated Code Malachite. It wasn't a virus in the traditional sense. It wasn't even an executable. It was a nested instruction set disguised as an organic telemetry update. Its function was simple. Once received, it would implant a false sensor reading in any system that prioritized hive distribution routes. The Salkari used these routing nodes to optimize their internal patrol logic. They were designed to self-correct based on environmental data. Malachite made them reroute away from threats that didn't exist. Each insertion was time-stringered. Rourke didn't want instant results. He wanted pattern decay. Gradual erosion masked as routine system drift. That made it harder to trace, harder to isolate. It wouldn't set off alarms. It would simply make the Salkari trust their own infrastructure less. Run sequence 3, Rourke ordered. The lights flickered as the processor engaged. A cold interface lit up across the main console, displaying a glitched star map. Certain Salkari trade lines were now appearing with red overlays. We just turned their surveillance net into hallucination, muttered Bishop, watching the map twist into unreadable folds. Not a hallucination, Roy corrected, a memory disorder. The next step was more dangerous. Using the dead to speak. They reactivated the signal from Vulna Primus. Not the original SOS. That had been erased the moment the orbital shield collapsed. This was different. Fabricated from thermal patterns, seismic stress logs, and pre-bombardment atmospheric disruptions. Rourke had rebuilt it manually from stored fragments in reactor data. It wasn't an emergency broadcast. It was a routine colonial scan update, the kind that drifted across neutral channels and got logged without question. It contained no threat, no request for help, just mundane sensor logs, minerals found, soil composition, atmospheric variables, things that no longer existed. They beamed it from a derelict communications buoy orbiting a non-martyred asteroid field on the edge of a forgotten sector. The buoy had been gutted and rebuilt from scratch. Its ID codes mimicked Salkari relay customs. The signal was faint, lazy, background noise, but it had a timestamp that was impossible. Vulna Primus was gone, everyone knew it. So when the Salkari intelligence array detected a new sensor update from it, their HiveNet entered review mode. They didn't respond. They didn't send a ship. But they rerouted 3 fleet paths within 24 hours. Subtle. Reactionary. But it told Rourke everything he needed. They were afraid of things that didn't make sense. That meant their logic systems were no longer confident in their own certainty. It was working, but not without cost. During the 6th signal test, Karen, one of the more psychologically stable operatives, disconnected mid-simulation. He left the neural interface abruptly, stumbled into the corridor, and stood motionless outside the filtration chamber for 10 minutes. Rourke found him there, still fully suited, visor down. "You all right?" Rourke asked, not with concern but with operational clarity. Karen didn't look over. "We're changing them, not killing them. Bending their perception. That's the plan. Lee won't see it coming." Rourke waited. "Does that bother you?" "No," Karen said finally. "But it bothers me that the moral cost had begun to surface. Not in resistance, but in recognition. This wasn't war. It was ghostcraft. Rewriting the enemy's sensory framework until their actions collapsed into irrelevance." That night, Rourke walked the outer ring of Varnex 4 looking out the viewing slit positioned at 34 degrees axial tilt. It faced no particular constellation, just an empty quadrant of transit-silent stars. He watched a slow-moving patrol beacon pass in the far distance. Salkari signature, moving erratically, not random. Confused. It had just avoided a corridor that didn't exist. He allowed himself a moment to breathe. Not relief, not pride, just function stabilizing. The plan was working. The ghosts they'd created were real enough now to reshape enemy movement, and they hadn't fired a shot. Not yet. The patrol beacon they'd tracked had no business shifting orbit. Solcari navigation nodes were rigid, coded for efficiency, incapable of improvisation. But this one had veered 5 degrees off its designated arc, compensating for a corridor that didn't physically exist. It wasn't evasion, it was avoidance, triggered by ghost data the hive believed was real. Rourke stared at the orbital drift records from the command console in Varnex 4's lower scan module. 6 anomalies across 3 adjacent sectors, all within a navigational pattern that, when overlaid, formed a spiraling vector. He adjusted the filters, shifting from beacon trajectory to supply routing, then from supply routing to gravitational anchor points. A curved line emerged, one that bent sharply, at an intersection, in the middle of nowhere. "Bring up map echo frequency layer," he said aloud, and Vance responded from the auxiliary station behind him. Loaded. On the updated display, a slow ripple moved outward from the spiral's core. It wasn't visual. It wasn't even electromagnetic. It was behavioral drift. The Solcari fleets were avoiding a zone, like it radiated uncertainty. "That," Rourke muttered, pointing at the center of the spiral, "isn't a no-go zone, it's a blind spot." Karen joined them at the console, rubbing a datapad clean with a stained cloth. "Hidden installation?" "No. They wouldn't hide fleet yards that way. This isn't logistical, it's conceptual." He zoomed further. The zone at the spiral's core had no designation in galactic records. It wasn't on any patrol routes, contained no mineral claims, and had no recorded traffic for over 30 years. But the last known signal received in that region, according to declassified Kepler records, had been a deep-range scan request, sent by a Solcari drone. It had never returned. Vance narrowed his eyes. What if they're not avoiding it? What if their system refuses to acknowledge it? Rourke nodded slowly. "Because it's too important to recognize openly." He brought up dormant climate models from the zone's regional space. Most sectors showed standard fluctuation patterns, but the spiral's core had static conditions, unchanging, uninterrupted by solar debris or weather fluctuations. No environment behaves that consistently, not unless it's being managed. He opened an older archive from a now-defunct Alliance project that had attempted to scan galactic gravitational fields for anomalies. One report, buried in a failure log, mentioned a multi-axis deviation in that exact location. It had been dismissed as faulty sensor calibration. Rourke traced the coordinate stream backward. It intersected with 3 other Solcari vectors, from supply paths routed through indirect corridors, each one terminating at different nodes, yet all passing near this blank zone. That wasn't randomness. That was converging symmetry. "Print everything," he ordered. Thorne moved to the manual interface. "What are we labeling this?" Rourke looked back at the screen, still centered on that dead spiral. "Even so." No one in the room responded with disbelief. That possibility had always lingered beneath the surface of Theta 9. The origin node. The one place untouched by diplomacy, battle, or surveillance. A sanctuary, made sacred through assumption. They worked through the next 30 hours without sleep. Telemetry bursts were decoded frame by frame. Atmospheric density gradients were reconstructed from scattered ion data scraped off previous Solcari patrol logs. It was slow, exacting work, like trying to sketch a planet's terrain from the echoes left by ships that had never officially acknowledged passing near it. Vance discovered a repeating sequence buried in one of the overlapping gravitational fields. Barely visible, masked by solar interference. "Pulse pattern," he said. 1 every 13 minutes. Rhythmic. Not natural. Tuesday Prandtl. No. Environmental regulator. High orbit. Thorne tapped into an old predictive model, once used for terraforming climate scaffolding. When applied to the anomaly zone, it suggested a weather grid operating on a regulated distribution pattern, artificial control of wind drift, thermal exchange, and storm cycle initiation. Rourke exhaled slowly. They've been shaping the planet's surface climate for centuries. That required an infrastructure so massive it couldn't be cloaked by technology alone. The only way to keep Eden Zero hidden was to embed its concealment inside enemy assumptions. by making the idea of locating it incomprehensible to outsiders. They didn't expect anyone to search for Eden Zero, not because it was protected, but because they believed no one would dare. This isn't just sacred ground, Rourke said. It's their original logic node. Their entire species' behavior could be anchored to its environmental stasis. If we break this, we don't just hurt them, we undo them. For the first time, even Thorne hesitated. You're talking about targeting their birth world, cultural collapse, psychological annihilation. Rourke answered flatly. They started with ours. He opened a secondary simulation interface. Feed the weather grid anomaly into the delivery system schematic. Map entry points for drone dispersal, low orbit to surface level interaction. They would need a payload capable of passing as organic, something that could enter Eden's ecosystem without triggering defense protocols. Not bombs, not data. Biotech. Karen stepped forward, watching as Rourke's fingers danced across the console. You sure we can reach it without triggering an alert? We don't reach it, Rourke replied. We replicate something they're already expecting. Their relay paths suggest routine ecological injections, biological modulation programs run every 2 months. They'll never notice one more drop in the water. And if they do, by then they'll already be drinking it. He turned away from the screen, letting the final model run its simulation. Within 4 planetary cycles, the planet's pollination network would begin to reverse. Within 6, hive nodes would suffer regulatory failure. By the 8th, climate drift would render the central cortex non-functional. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be immediate, but it would end them. As the last printout emerged from the analog feed showing a fragmented image of the planet's thermal symmetry, Rourke picked it up with care. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't even fully complete, but it was enough. The image showed a single anomaly in the middle of a symmetrical climate grid. One pulse. A fraction out of sync with the rest. A heartbeat. They'd found it. The delivery vessels weren't ships in any conventional sense. They were gliders. Stripped-down composite frames no larger than an atmospheric stabilizer, coated in reflective foil that mimicked the spectral signature of pollen drift. No engines, no guidance systems, no thermal residue. Once deployed, they would descend through Eden Nello's upper atmosphere like rogue biological debris, exactly the sort of irregularities the sultry weather net had learned to ignore. Each glider carried 12 canisters the size of a closed fist, housing self-modifying nanite clusters, cold green engineered to mimic the biochemical signature of native microfauna. They were silent. They were blind. They had no AI core or control uplink. Just one directive embedded in the spike proteins of their outer casing. Adapt to the first encountered organic pattern. Multiply. Dr. Ilan Tourev stood beside the final loading rack, double-checking the sequence codes, not from doubt, but from habit. He had worked on nanotechnic harvest agents for Terran agricultural colonies for over 2 decades before they were banned. The work he was doing now wasn't a continuation. It was retribution wrapped in replication. Rourke approached from the upper scaffold, hands behind his back, gaze fixed on the deployment window. You still haven't named them, Rourke said quietly. Tourev didn't look up. Naming implies ownership. That's not what this is. What is it then? A response. The gliders launched in sets of 4, released into a low-orbit descent vector, plotted to intersect with the standard salt-carry climate injection corridor. The timing had to be exact, aligned to their orbital regulator's calibration pulse. If they deviated by more than 3 seconds, the entire net might engage and sterilize the entry point. They didn't. Each glider entered Eden Zero's atmosphere without triggering so much as a fluctuation in the sky grid. The canisters released at 3,000 meters, separating into clouds of microfilaments so small they drifted on ionized wind like spore mist. The nanites landed in forest zones, wet basin ecosystems, shallow ocean shelves. Not to destroy, not to signal, to become. Initial readings returned after 48 hours. Rourke reviewed them in silence. The soil in Landing Zone 3 began blooming with anomalous growth. dense matting that lacked reproductive coating but consumed nutrients at 10 times the expected rate. Insectoid patterns began deviating from regular migratory routes, drawn to synthetic pheromone loops emitted by the clusters. Pollination nodes, once stable, began emitting conflicting quorum pulses, small at first, then expanding in erratic, overlapping waves. It's a feedback inversion, Torov explained during the third report cycle. The hives are trying to correct for data that doesn't align with environmental expectations. But the correction triggers another layer of misinformation, which the system interprets as a deeper anomaly, which leads to further recalibration, Rourke finished, and then collapse. By the end of the 5th day, central coordination began to falter. The drones managing Eden Zero's ecosystem started replicating tasks unnecessarily. Pollination cycles repeated in locations that had already been saturated. Rain fell twice in the same sector within hours. Microbial balances shifted. Native fungi began growing on exposed silicon deposits. Trees that required dry root beds bloomed in flooded swamplands. It wasn't an attack. It was a misalignment of purpose so subtle that even Xeno didn't realize it was dying until its own systems accelerated the process. Inside the observation chamber, Karen pulled up a diagnostic graph showing the collapse curves across 5 ecological sectors. That's the 3rd weather tower to self-diagnose failure, he noted. They're rotating leadership pulses between subordinate hives without stabilization. Their response matrix is fragmenting. Thorne leaned over the data. They're assigning blame internally. We didn't trigger a defense response because they think it's their fault. That was the point, Rourke said. You can't defend against something you believe came from inside. But not all reactions were silent. On day 7, a Salkari relay burst from a long-range node outside Eden Zero. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even an alert. It was a question: is the hive flawed? The phrase was stripped of context, no coordinates, no source identifier, just that line, repeated across multiple logic bands. The Salkari were asking themselves whether their core was compromised, not because of any attack, but because their sacred algorithms had started looping. Torev stood beside the biosample bay that evening, reviewing the final stage models. His hands trembled. Not out of fear, but from the magnitude of what had begun. We didn't just infiltrate a planet, he said, not facing anyone. We introduced doubt into their birth logic. Their world no longer trusts itself. Rourke didn't respond. He stared at the most recent aerial feed of Eden Zero's central forest belt. The canopy had shifted color overnight. Not in autumnal rhythm, but in response to light triggers that no longer obeyed seasonal cues. Where there had been green, there was now a bruised maroon, spreading like rot. That wasn't death. That was identity collapse. Aaron exhaled sharply. We've done it. No, Rourke said, cold and flat. We've begun it. The inflection wasn't celebratory. It was a statement of trajectory. What they'd initiated couldn't be walked back, couldn't be undone. It wouldn't stop at systems decay. The effects would echo through hive memory, restructure logic foundations, ripple across every command hierarchy tied to Eden's neurogrid. And all of it had started with the dusting of nanites carried on simulated wind. Later that night, as Varnex 4 moved out of alignment with the Eden vector, Rourke remained alone at the viewport, watching the last transmission window flicker with data bleed. The weather grid was still active, but its symmetry had fractured. It didn't rotate smoothly anymore. It stuttered. From a distance, it looked almost rhythmic, like a broken metronome still trying to keep time. Eden Villa's fall wasn't broadcast by Earth. It was broadcast by the Salkari themselves. 3 days after the pollination collapse reached the equatorial belts, an emergency relay flared across 9 sectors of Salkari-controlled space. Not encrypted, not tactical, public. A singular anomaly in their communication protocol. The hive had defaulted to a non-logical state, distress, an action it was never programmed to execute. The message looped in over 75 languages via auto-translators, repeating one phrase. Origin function compromised. Request clarification. There was no source identifier, no command header, just that sentence, fed into the galactic net like a blind scream. It arrived at every listening post in the Accord, including the Terran Assembly's orbital feed hub. Inside the chamber, delegates watched in frozen silence as the message repeated, again and again, overlaying itself against footage that had already leaked from covert sources. Low-orbit surveillance of Eden's weather grid spiraling into staggered loops, its forests darkening by sector, its oceans filling with lightless churn from dead phytoplankton stacks. On one screen, Eden 0 fell apart. On the other, Vulna Primus burned in recorded memory. They were placed side by side. Split screen. No commentary, no voiceover. The galaxy watched in real time as the first species to dismiss humanity as unstable now begged for clarification from a system incapable of delivering it. Someone within the Terran broadcast station activated a secondary feed, unauthorized but intentional. Rourke's face filled the mainframe. It wasn't a live recording. It had been queued days earlier, set to trigger in response to a Salkari Level 7 transmission pattern. He sat in a neutral room, plain walls, no insignia. No rank bars. Just a man in a black undersuit, eyes focused, voice measured. "I'm not here to justify what you're seeing," he said. "I'm here to confirm it." No one in the Terran assembly chamber spoke. Not the diplomats, not the observers. No one interrupted. "You told us logic was paramount, that emotion was disorder. You demonstrated your clarity by burning 3 of our colonies, killing hundreds of thousands without warning, then calling it necessary pruning. You told us nothing after. No apology, no correction." His tone didn't rise, it remained flat like he was dictating a maintenance log. So we responded in kind. Not by building bigger fleets, not by threatening retaliation. We studied your system. We learned your blind spots. And we seeded doubt where you least expected it. Your own memory. Behind him, a faint screen lit up. It showed the Salkari distress message still looping. You are not dying because we overpowered you. You are dying because you failed to imagine we might think differently than you. You are dying because you believed fear only wore the face of firepower. On the screen beside him, Vulna's recorded footage replayed. The colony dome shattering, the shield collapse. The silence afterward. In Eden's sky, stuttering like a corrupted file. No fleet is coming, no demands will follow. We don't want reparations. We don't want negotiations. We don't even want acknowledgement. Rourke's face leaned forward slightly. We want you to remember this, every time you reorganize your hierarchy. Every time your logic trees fail to align. Every time your weather patterns loop wrong and your oceans go still. We want you to remember why. He stood. The camera pulled back to show nothing but an empty room after he left. No insignia, no music, no transition. Just a blank space. The feed ended. For almost a full minute, the assembly chamber remained soundless. Then the Salkari delegate, one of the few not connected to Eden Zaro's central function, stood shakily. His body frame twitched in uncoordinated shudders, his vocal appendage failing to align with protocol formatting. This is illegal." The words felt fragile. Rourke's message wasn't a declaration. It was a ledger entry. The galaxy began responding, not with outrage, but with silence. Several border nations closed their diplomatic lanes to Salkari traffic. Trade liaisons delayed ship authorizations, citing system review, knowing full well the Salkari wouldn't question human timing again. No one praised the attack. No one condemned it. It wasn't about moral high ground. It was about what happened when you underestimate the survivor. On Varnax 4, the crew of Scorchwing reviewed the feedback loops from Eden Zero's atmospheric monitors. The rainfall pattern had stopped adjusting altogether. The planet's surface temperatures began deviating without correction. Torev stood at the rear of the observatory chamber, watching a forest sector spin itself into chemical entropy. "There's no more quorum," he said, almost to himself. "They've lost decision consensus. It's all local now. They're trapped in their own perimeter, Vance added. No central override, just independent units reacting to ghosts. Rourke didn't reply. He sat in the command chair, helmet resting on his knee, eyes not on the screen, but on the small tag he'd kept from Vulna's last registry. A salvage scrap with a pressure seal code. Lyra's workstation. She'd signed it once with her name. It had burned black. Now only the serial remained. He folded it and pocketed it. He never asked if we'd remember them, Rourke said quietly. Karen stepped into the room, holding the final confirmation file. The Eden Initiative was complete. No reversals pending. No new growths detected. The planetary biosphere was entering permanent dysfunction. What now? Thorne asked. Rourke didn't answer immediately. Then, now they learn what silence feels like. No more transmissions were sent. No broadcasts followed. Humanity had delivered no threat, raised no banners, made no conquests. But the Solkari would never forget what happened when they tried to erase a species that kept its grief quiet, its hands steady, and its rage aimed. The Solkari Dominion disbanded without ceremony. No treaties were signed, no white flags raised. Their central hive structure, once a monument of unbroken governance, fragmented into isolated nodes, each broadcasting different procedural routines with no shared alignment. They tried to rebuild order, but Eden-No's collapse had severed something deeper than just command links. The galaxy watched as Solkari fleets drifted into inaction, then into silence. Their border patrols vanished from trade lanes, their embassies ceased transmission, entire sectors went dark. The species that once dictated policy with arithmetic certainty now barely responded to diplomatic pings. When one of their surviving science ships finally docked in neutral space 6 weeks later, its crew couldn't articulate why they were there. Their translators glitched mid-sentence. Thought and speech had lost harmony. No one moved against them. No one needed to. The Terran Assembly held one formal session to close the incident. No flags were raised, no celebrations, just seats filled, statements read into record, and eyes trained on the only person who hadn't spoken since the retaliation began. Rourke Miles stood alone at the central podium. He wore no uniform, just a gray field jacket, the same one he'd pulled from Vulna's wreckage. No medals, no insignia, only a small silver chip in his left sleeve, authentication marker for the operation. The chamber lights dimmed. He placed a sealed file on the presentation pad. The pad scanned it, verified it, then projected the title above the delegates. Chapter 9, Execution Complete. There were no objections, no requests for clarification. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. I was asked to submit a final statement. Rourke began, his hands folded in front of him. Not as justification, not as vindication, but as record. He let the silence settle, the room did not interrupt. Everyone killed our people because they believed logic excused cruelty. They assumed our grief would paralyze us, that our pain made us weak. They believed they could demonstrate superiority by reducing us to ash, and that we would accept it. He looked across the room, not at faces, but through them. No anger, no sorrow, just fact. He believed they were wrong. The screen above him flickered once. 2 still images appeared, side by side. Vulna Primus in flames. Eden open, cracked open under failing weather patterns. No animation, no commentary, just impact and consequence. We didn't retaliate with conquest. We didn't burn cities or demand penance. We studied, we waited, and when the time came, we showed them that being underestimated was humanity's greatest weapon. No one moved. No one spoke. He placed his hand on the table, activating the secondary layer of the report. Operational logs, deployment chains, casualty lists, Scorchwing's final roster. All filed. All public. Nothing redacted. You'll find everything inside, including the methods, the timelines, and the psychological markers used to guide the engagement. There was no overreach. There was no accident. He paused, not for effect, but for something deeper. Something harder to name. I make no apology for what was done. There are none to offer. They didn't apologize when they vaporized our children. They didn't hesitate when they called it pruning. So I will not flinch from the truth. He lifted the final page, his signature printed in the corner. A simple name, not rank, not title. Just Rourke Miles, citizen of Earth. He placed it back in the file and stepped away from the podium. No applause followed, only silence. The kind that didn't demand more, the kind that meant something had ended. Later, as the assembly adjourned, Rourke waited by the exit hall. He wasn't escorted. He didn't need to be. No one stopped him. A few delegates nodded, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. Not as a soldier, not as a hero, as the man who'd answered a crime the galaxy pretended not to hear. He returned to Vulna's orbit once reconstruction teams confirmed partial atmospheric stability. Not for memorials. The site remained untouched, overgrown now with rogue flora and broken sky panels. The air was thin but breathable. He found the bench where Lyra used to calibrate the moisture regulators, rusted now, half swallowed by soil. He sat. No words, no thoughts to gather, only stillness. A signal pinged in his comm. Auto-sent from Earth. One sentence. Scorchwing hive memory archives have ceased transmission. It was done. He turned off the comm. Let the wind pass over the cracked surface. Humanity hadn't just survived. They hadn't begged. They hadn't folded. They'd listened, planned, responded, and ended the threat not by copying their enemy's brutality, but by outthinking it. By using what made them human, grief, memory, fury, as architecture, not chaos. The Salkari believed emotion was a flaw. What they didn't understand was that humanity weaponized the very thing they dismissed. And in the end, that was why they lost. Rourke stood, brushing dirt from his sleeve. He left no markers, no symbols, only the silence behind him. The silence earned, and a message that needed no repetition. They bombed our colonies. We reduced their homeworld to ashes. If this story hit hard, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and comment your favorite moment. More ruthless HFY drops are coming soon.